All right, tonight we're going to talk about early intervention and supports and services. This is also known as early childhood education. So this is sometimes birth to 5, or for school age based, it's usually age 3, so preschool through 2nd grade. So some of the history in pre-1930s, there was a belief that abilities were fixed at birth. So what you were born with is what you had. It didn't matter. You couldn't change it. So if you had developmental delays, you were always going to have developmental delays, those type of things. 1930, Scales and Dye show that fostered children fare better than those in orphanages. So we know kids who have that nurture quality, a family around them, as opposed to an orphanage. I'm not saying orphanages don't do some great things, but those who have family units around them do better. In the 30s, we also started to look at early childhood programs, so things like preschool, nursery school, those type of things. And in 1950, Kirk did some work to demonstrate the importance of preschool. I always chuckle at this one because I have a friend who is very bright, who loves to tell anyone who will listen she did not go to preschool because she was too smart for it. This dear friend of mine who I love also can never be wrong. So perhaps some of those preschool skills were missed at that point in time. They started to look at long-term effects of caregiver practices. So again, that's not all nurture for early childhood. That there are things that in-home can happen, that preschools can happen, that can support kids developing the skills they need. In the 60s, High Scope Perry Preschool Project begins. It was a longitudinal study of 123 at-risk students. They were considered at-risk because at that point, when kids are that young, 3 to 5 years old, now we usually identify it as developmental delay, but we hate to give kids a disability unless it is something very evident, such as a child with Down syndrome having an intellectual disability. But if it is not an evident disability, we try not to label kids that young. Again, in the 70s, we really started to look at not just did it work to have preschools or childcare, quality childcare, but what was the impact? And if you think about this, this is when we started seeing many more moms going into the workforce, kids needing quality childcare. 1968, Handicapped Children's Early Education System Act set up a model program to demonstrate how early intervention could work. So they put something together to show the nation how it could work, what this could look like state to state. 1986, 94 Public Law 99-457 extended mandated services for children with disabilities from birth to age 6. This was huge. Prior to this, until they were in school, there was no mandated services. So now, kids at birth can receive services starting day 1 or even sometimes prenatally, and that was based on this change in the 80s. In 2004, IDEA Part C addresses the need of children from birth to 2, and IDEA Part B addresses children from 3 to 5. So they got their own subsections, and they are very detailed in the law. If you plan on working in early childhood, either birth to 3 is usually what we say, or 3 to 5, you'll really want to get to know IDEA Part C and IDEA Part B. So what is early intervention? Early intervention or early childhood education or early childhood special education provides sustained support to families, to caregivers, and to children with developmental delays. The big difference in early intervention and school-aged intervention is families are a much bigger piece of it. So we provide, instead of having an individual education plan, they have an individual family service plan. So they get services wrapped around the child and the family. That's why early childhood goes out and does a lot of home visits. Families are brought in, child find, all those good things. We have started to understand that the earlier we can intervene and support students or children and support families, the better chance we have of these kids with developmental delays or other needs catching up to their typical peers. It is services for birth to age 5, although a lot of ours will focus on ages 3 and up, because that's what we do for school age with the preschool type work, and addresses needs of children and child's family during. The big thing here is we are now looking so much at these areas. You know, what happens in pregnancy? How can we support families in pregnancy? How can we support babies who are born and we know there's a disability there and start at infancy? How can we support kids in pre-kindergarten years, which again goes back to that 3 to 5? And make sure they're getting supports and interventions, whether it be in a structured program or whether it be at home. The early years matter, and as a country, we are learning this more and more. A lot of the federal dollars that are coming out right now, a lot of the grant money that's coming out right now, is to provide better services for early childhood education and early childhood special education, because we know how important those first years are and how important that 3 to 5 years is, and to support getting more certified, qualified, trained early childhood educators. Fortunately, a lot of our early childhood interventionists did not get a lot of training. So they're in Head Start programs, or they're in home preschools or home daycares and things, and they don't have any actual training. And part of that's because they've been stay-at-home moms who are balancing their own kids and other kids, and they can't go back to school. And so now nationally we're looking at ways to get these individuals training so that they can better support the kids, so they have a better skill set, and so that they can be respected in the field as they should be. We're going to skip this since we're not actually in class together, and talk about family-centered support. Family-centered support really came out of early intervention, and it's kind of what I was talking about earlier with, instead of students getting an IEP or an individual education plan, they get an IFSP, or an individual family services plan. We really realize, and it came out early childhood, and hopefully it's spreading to other areas, but we've got to center it around the whole family, because especially when kids are really young, they spend way more time with family, home caregivers, those type of things, than they do, and maybe that's grandma and grandpa, maybe that's aunt and uncle, but that's still family, than they do out in the world. So we know we need to partner with families in a meaningful way, and that doesn't mean just invite them to the table. That means we need to be listening to them. They know more about their children than we do, and that goes across K-12 and preschool. That's not just the little ones. We need to be culturally responsive in working with families, understanding their background and their attitudes, accepting that we don't know it all, but we do need to know because it is important and it is relevant. And so making sure we're opening dialogue and having conversations to learn about other families, what their culture is, what their community is, what their home life is, and to support that, but also to respect that. And understanding that family context is critical to understanding the child. If we do not know what's going on at home, we are not going to be able to help this child appropriately. We've got to understand family dynamics, community dynamics, cultural dynamics, all of those type of things to be able to support both the families and that student. Early intervention in natural environments. So natural environments in early childhood refers to the practice of facilitating learning through experiences and daily activities and routines. So we don't sit kids who are 3 to 5 down and have them work on their ABCs on a worksheet or on a tablet. Instead, we should be embedding that into their natural routines. If you're going to the store, ooh, that's an apple. What letter does apple start with? A. Good job. Can we sing our ABCs now? Let's sing them while we go get some bananas, because B comes next. Those type of things. They should be play-based. They should be daily activities and routines. They should not be, it is not developmentally appropriate for it to be worksheets and computer games. Most services are offered in home settings, so prior to 3, you can have interventionists come in, home visitors, home health, occupational physical therapists, speech language, case managers that come into the home, and then once they're in a preschool setting, then you may still get some home visits, but a lot of those natural environment will be translated into the preschool, but those preschoolers will still be doing them as a natural activity and play-based and embedded in every day. Detecting, screening is so important for these little ones. There are some disabilities that we know begin at birth. I had a friend whose granddaughter was pregnant and had a child with Down syndrome, did not know the baby was going to be born with Down syndrome, and was not getting any services. And she finally came to me because she was not in special education, and I explained she should have gotten services from the moment that baby was born. The hospital, when they recognized it, should have started hooking her up with services, providers, all of that type of thing. So we know at birth there are some disabilities, and every hospital should be coordinating for those families and starting case management for those. But we also need screeners. That's why we do preschool roundup. That's always one of my favorites. We're doing roundup night, and we're rounding up all the little kids, and what we're doing is screening for developmental delays. We're checking to see who's on target, who needs some help. The APGAR test is administered in an infant's first few minutes and can detect potential problems, so every hospital should be doing that. Hearing screenings are standard for newborn. Newborn behavioral observations is used to detect special needs of infants through natural observation. Usually those type of things, you start noticing things, whether hearing, whether behavioral, start having conversations with your pediatrician. Your pediatrician should be well versed in these and should be able to support the family. Those are the first steps of the hospitals. So medical is really the front end of this because we don't have them in school yet. What is a developmental delay? Developmental delay means we know they're not meeting the same benchmarks as their same age peers, but we also know all kids develop differently, especially in those very early ages. So we call it a developmental delay because we don't want to identify a student with or a child with a disability at 2. I used to work with kids with emotional behavioral disorders, and they would come to me with a kindergartner and say, this kid needs a label. They've got EBD. He's 5. Unless he has burden on the school, don't talk to me about this. He might have behaviors, but it may just be maladaptive behaviors. Have we had time to work on it? Have we intervened? Have we done interventions? No, we're not labeling a 4 or 5-year-old with emotional behavioral disorder. And so that's where developmental delays come in. And you'll see there's 5 domains: cognitive, communicative, social emotional, motor, and adaptive behaviors. And the social emotional right here is why I'm not labeling a 4 or 5-year-old with emotional behavioral disorder. Early intervention seeks to optimize those developmental programs so that we hope to bring kids up to typical development. We know, this is why I was just saying, we know all kids develop differently. So it's not saying on your first birthday, every kid should be talking or every kid should be walking. But there is usually a span that we look at, and we try and make sure kids are within that span. And if they're not, get them the supports that they need. Risk factors for developmental delays. Genetic disorders. There are a lot of genetic disorders, and that's kind of that nature piece. Events during pregnancy and birth, if the mama experienced trauma, malnutrition, drugs and alcohol, abuse, anything like that, that can affect the pregnancy. And then environmental factors. Living in an environment where maybe you only have processed food options. So in a lot of bigger cities where they can't get fresh foods and vegetables or can't get medical care. Some other countries where there's no medical care to be had. Those type of things. So environmental factors. Low birth weight, prematurity, and serious medical complications are all risk factors for delay. So if you have a premature baby, if you have a baby who's born really small, or if there's any kind of medical complication, umbilical cord issues, loss of oxygen, those type of things, all of those are likely going to lead to some kind of delay. Now, not all of them are permanent. Sometimes we get interventions, we get them up to speed, and they're good to go. But there's probably going to be some delays. We don't know everything or even a lot about genetic disorders at this point. We're still learning every day. And so there are some that can be screened before birth. I know for a fact Down syndrome is one of them. You can screen for genetically for Down syndrome. There are others that can be as well, but there's a lot that can't. There is a case to be made for autism being genetic disorder, and that is not one we can screen for. So we're still just, this is a newer branch of science, really, in the big scheme of things. Obviously, a mother's health during pregnancy impacts the development of her baby. Right now, we're seeing a lot of moms who have struggled with COVID through all of this, and we have yet to see what the real outcomes are going to be from what they've gone through. Substance abuse, again, drugs and alcohol will have effects on the baby. Environmental conditions, we just talked about this, but not only environmental conditions for the parents, but for that the child lives in. So the child is in poverty. If there's trauma, we've talked about trauma-informed, we'll continue to talk about trauma-informed, child abuse. These are all risk factors for developmental delays. Kids that are inside all the time because of safety of neighborhoods and things, that can be a risk factor. What is child find? Child find is, the onus is on schools. It is legally mandated by IDEA, which we talked about a couple weeks ago, and it seeks to identify, locate, and evaluate children who need early intervention or special education services. We have to, as district, find ways to assess kids and identify kids who need help that are not in the school system yet. So the most common one, and the one we're talking about tonight, is for early intervention. And again, this is where we do those preschool call-outs. This is where we partner with local social service programs that support families and young children. It is our job to go out. It is not the family's job to come knocking on the school's door and say, hey, I need some help. It is the school's job to go out and provide opportunities for us to be able to screen and identify kids who need help so that we then can get them those services. Once a child has been identified by Child Find, a family member or other provider, an assessment must be done to determine eligibility for services. So once that is identified that yes, something's going on, then we must do an assessment to determine if it is. And this right here is really important, and it's really sad that's still a fact. Females, minorities, and children in poverty are less likely to be identified for services. We have to do a better job of getting out into communities where we have poverty, where there are a lot of minorities, where there's a lot of single parent households, mostly female, and do a better job of not saying, hey, we're going to have preschool roundup at the middle school on Thursday night. Bring your kids. These moms are working. There may be, if we're in poverty, we may not have car, we may not have transportation, we may not have childcare for our other kids. There are all sorts of factors. We can't expect them always to come to us. So we need to go out and into these communities and find these kids and support these families. Quality. This has always been a thing. Early childhood has not always been regulated the same way K-12 education is regulated, so there is a concern with the quality of services. Quality pre-K could drastically alter the trajectory for kids. State funding for pre-K programs has declined in recent years, but in the last year, we're seeing this one go back up. We're seeing more funding coming. We realize this was a mistake. We know that if we want it to be a quality program, it has to be low student-teacher ratio, high education for teachers. That's why there's that funding out there to get more early childhood teachers trained and supported and licensed, positive social interactions, and appropriate academic stimulation. Again, appropriate being play-based and natural environment-based, not paper and pencil. RTI, we talked about this last week. Here's the triangle, folks. There we go. Okay, tier 1, 2, 3. It's the same in early childhood as it is in other models. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on this. We'll talk a lot about RTI over the next couple of years, but just know that it is the same whether it be RTI or PBIS for early childhood as it is in other models. The IFSP, this is what I was talking about. You probably want to write this down. An IFSP is called an Individual Family Supports Program. It is the equivalent of the IEP in K-12 education. The difference is it focuses on service and supports around families. How can we get those supports into the home? How can we get those supports to parents? How can we train parents to partner and help their kids work on OT or PT or speech when someone's not there? You do still have to have a multidisciplinary team that has education professionals, health professionals, and the parents. Parental involvement is central. No one should ever be writing an IFSP without parents at the table, without that parental involvement. Inclusion, like all educational programs, we have multiple variations along the continuum. We have self-contained classrooms for kids with disabilities. We have what we call blended programs or community programs where you will have about 40% of the little ones have a disability. The other 60% are typically developing peers. And then we have fully inclusive programs. Obviously, blended and inclusive are going to be better than self-contained in most cases because kids are going to have the opportunity to have those social relationships with typically developing peers. They're going to be able to see typical development in motor skills and in sharing and all those type of things. The one dilemma with inclusion is how do we make sure children receive the appropriate intensity of services? I will tell you one way that's happening right now is a lot of programs are moving to require their early childhood teachers to be certified in both early childhood education, so general education for early childhood, and early childhood special education. So you have to hold both a gen ed early childhood and a special ed early childhood license to teach in those classrooms. And that's how we're making sure that you've got someone in there that can meet the needs of all kids. We've already talked about this. This goes along with the natural environments. Play comes naturally to children, and they learn about their environment that way. Play-based learning is a real thing. For years, particularly middle school and high school teachers have said, preschool teachers just play with kids all day, or kindergarten teachers just play with kids all day. And kind of said it like they don't really do anything or they're not a real teacher. Guess what? That's what they should be doing. That's exactly what they should be doing. They should not have kids sitting at tables for a long amount of time doing work. They should not have kids embedded onto computers or tablets for long parts of the day. Those kids should be doing play-based learning. That is what's developmentally appropriate. Developmentally appropriate practices, also known as DAP, because we like to shorten things. They outline best practices for early childhood. Also write down DEC, that is the Division of Early Childhood in CEC, and they are the leaders in early childhood special ed. So if you ever need anything on that realm, that's who you're going to go to. DEC in CEC. Assistive technology can be used to support learning. Technically, this is not an early childhood thing. We should be doing that in pre-kindergarten, preschool through 22 years of age. Transition in early childhood. Transition can cause stress, and one of the biggest stressors for this group is transitioning from the safety of an early childhood preschool program, which is low numbers, often a separate setting. Parents are heavily supported because they have that IFSP, to kindergarten, which is much more of our traditional school setting. Parents should be partners, but now they move to an IEP. Now it's focused on the student's education. It's not as much play-based learning. It should still be natural environment, but it's not as much play-based learning. This can be a really stressful time. So even though when we talk about transition services, we usually think about those kids moving from high school out into the adult world, transition in early childhood is a big piece, and we need to be understanding of that, those of you who want to work with young ones, either in preschool or kindergarten, this is going to be a big deal. You're going to be part of these transition conversations and part of these supporting, and a lot of it is not only supporting those kiddos, but supporting those families.